Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Douglas Campbell. Hello, Douglas. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I'm great, Douglas. So today we'll be discussing some of your fascinating papers, starting with China. Douglas, should we be concerned about the rise of China and its impact on the economies of Western Europe and North America?
I think the answer to that is yes. So probably a reasonable bit of concern would be justified. And so let me qualify by saying that it's not necessarily the case that the rise of China will be a bad thing. And there's many ways in which the rise of China will be a good thing. So when we, import cheap products from China, some of which are probably also high quality and they are built at a lower price than we could get otherwise. Obviously, consumers benefit. There's also a lot of innovation happening in China, and so a lot of this innovation will disseminate to the US and just means faster economic growth for the world as a whole. On the other hand, I think that as the globalization happened and as the rise of China happened in practice in the late 1990s and early 2000s, I think there's a lot of evidence that suggests that it did contribute to sudden collapse in US manufacturing employment. And I think that this collapse was not handled very well by US policymakers and helped lead to this kind of decade of slow growth, or what's the so-called secular stagnation, this slowdown in growth in the US and in other developed economies since around 2000.
Okay.
And so, some of the evidence for this is that the 2000s themselves, despite the housing bubble in the US, which is really an international housing bubble, also including Europe, despite that housing bubble, is actually a decade of slow growth. The labor market in the US is not doing very well. And that was despite this kind of housing bubble and very low interest rates. And I think the reason for that is mostly has to do with the rise of China and also US real exchange rate overvaluation in the early 2000s. So,
Douglas, historically, countries do compete and nations rise and fall. The Industrial Revolution occurred in Britain, then countries like France and Germany followed. And during the early 20th century, Germany was seen as aggressive. So I do get your points quite clearly. But are we exaggerating the rise of China? The rise of China as a state is not unusual. As I said, states rise and fall all the time, and new competitors emerge. And based on what we do know, China has a policy of non-interference.
well, and usually when a new world leader, a new world global hegemon comes in to power, usually there's a lot of wars between the two, the outgoing power and the incoming power. So, the Britain and the US fought a couple of wars. There's a couple German wars as Germany got more powerful. So, the Dutch also fought with the British. The Portuguese fought with the Dutch as well. So it would not be unexpected based on history that maybe there would be a little bit of aggression between the US and China in the future. But anything is possible. There might not be this time. Who knows? But I think the US foreign policy establishment and the economic policy establishment and trade people as well should at least be aware that that's a possibility that at some point the US and China could enter into a war, right? So we should also do everything possible so that it does not happen. But if you at least allow the possibility that could be a situation one day in the future where the US and China are in a state of aggression between each other, then the idea that we should just not worry at all about, say, relying on China for some kind of intermediate inputs or for manufactured goods, that idea looks a little bit crazy, I think. And I think this is something which, if you go back 5 years, very few people, either policymakers within the US, even before Trump, actually, if you go before Trump, very few policymakers, either in especially in Democratic policy circles, thought that the rise of China was much of a problem, or maybe it had some impact on inequality, but that we really shouldn't change, not worth changing the status quo. I think after the pandemic, I think it just kind of dawned on people that, hey, when you're in a pandemic like this, you don't want to be dependent on China to import masks or some kind of badly needed good. So we would not want to have to import all of our vaccines from China. We would not want to be in the situation where we have to import all of our medical equipment from China, even if China is the lowest cost manufacturer. I think now a lot of people look and say, well, this is something that we should at least have some capability to do at home. And countries that don't have manufacturing capabilities for this kind of stuff have really missed out during the pandemic. So
America is still an economic superpower, and presently there is a trade surplus in favor of America, and this trade surplus is evident in intellectual property. The Chinese are still benefiting from second mover advantage, but I do get your point about being wary of China's aggression. But for America to contain China, it would need to rebrand its foreign policy, economic policy, and academic policy. The Chinese, for the most part, are not as individualistic as Americans, and even at the university level in China, based on my conversations with academics, Chinese students are less likely to critique professors. But what we do know is that the Chinese, they spend on R&D and they are serious about standards. And in America, there is a wave of nonsense taking place across several schools and universities where non-academic measures are being assigned relevance. And I don't think that that will become a problem in China. The Chinese still care more about the quality of their professionals than diversity or identity politics. So I think this is one area where China may have an edge. The Chinese leadership is more focused than the American leadership.
yeah, so I don't doubt that. I would actually say that on a wide range of issues that Chinese governments at the top leadership has been more on point than the US. And so, I mean, one could go back to the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. China had a much larger stimulus as a share of GDP as the US did. And then when the Chinese economy recovered, they also reduced the size of that stimulus in an appropriate manner. In the US, we had a much smaller federal stimulus. It turned out that the size of the federal stimulus was actually smaller than austerity measures going out on in state and local governments. And so the net stimulus in the US was actually less than zero. And we had a Democratic administration with 60 seats in the Senate at the time. And yeah, so things like that. And then so also following up on that, when it was shown that actually the stimulus wasn't enough to get the economy back moving again, there was no second round of stimulus in the US. Right. And so it was just much more on point in China than in the US. Also, the Chinese central bank went right away to do something called quantitative targeting, where they actually had the central bank was setting loan targets for banks, which is another thing that makes a lot of sense when you're maybe facing a severe recession or liquidity trap. That's something that the US did not try and probably should have.
Yeah, and what
Yeah.
I also find interesting is that Chinese leaders are pointed when speaking. They create long-term plans. This is not to suggest that Americans do not have long-term plans, but leaders in China won't get involved in Twitter scandals or feud with celebrity. There just seems to be a greater level of focus in China than in America. So even if America has multiple advantages, the Chinese are not distracted. They're so on the ball.
Yeah. So I mean, I think you could say this about some things, and maybe not necessarily with others. But so I remember when I visited China in 2005, and I went to some bookstore in Beijing, and then at some point I didn't want to wait for the elevator, so I walked on the stairs, and there was a bunch of Chinese students sitting in the stairwell, and they were like reading GRE books and organic chemistry books, studying for some exams. They didn't have enough money to pay for the book, and so they would go to the bookstore and read in the stairwell, right? And so you never would have found an American doing that, right? An American, you could have bought the book easily, but wouldn't have. And so I do think there is something like, it is impressive the way that a lot of economies in Eastern Europe have focused on education. On the other hand, though, is that how good is the quality of that education? A lot of it might be rote memorization. And so, they're learning some math, but then, the average person actually doesn't need to use a lot of math. So how tightly correlated is all that education with growth? It's not clear. I mean, so economists, pretty much everyone thinks that human capital is very important. But I would guess that, if you take the best schools in the US, for example, it's probably better than the best schools in China. But leadership, yeah, I think there's no doubt that at least some leadership.
Doug?
So.
Yes, you went away for a few seconds. You were saying some leadership.
Oh yeah, internet connection is unstable.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was saying that also during the pandemic, one could say that, the Chinese policy was fairly on point. I mean, not with everything. So I guess right out of the gate, there was some discussion that maybe the Chinese are trying to hide the pandemic, hide the extent of the virus. But then after that, they did a pretty good job controlling the virus in Wuhan. But then if you go further, I don't know that they did a very good job of actually restarting the economy and getting the vaccines out as well. But of course, when you have 1 billion people, it's more difficult.
Well, a scholar of the American Enterprise Institute shared an excellent piece on the Dispatch, arguing that in democracies, the response to pandemics is actually superior. So I think we are overrating how China managed the pandemic, because remember, the Chinese were not quite transparent. We're also skeptical of Chinese GDP data. We don't know when they're telling the truth. And there's a massive indoctrination plan on the way in China. Xi Jinping is not just a leader, he's also a philosopher. Xi Jinping wrote a book several years ago, and now there's even a children's book. So the Chinese are really more serious than the Americans about creating the new man for China in the future. But this is a disadvantage. For innovation to really blossom, we need radicals and eccentrics. You cannot just create an innovative economy. And this is what people are unable to appreciate. America is innovative because of institutions and culture. People must feel free to innovate. Individuals who fail are also rewarded for failure. And the Chinese and the Japanese are yet to truly appreciate the benefits of failure. Failing well is the key to success.
Yep. Yeah. Yep. I agree.
So. Yeah. So, and Douglas, and there's another missing angle in the puzzle. China is a rule by law state, not a rule of law state, according to Joseph Fewsmith, and I have belabored this point on many occasions. Historically in China, whenever there is a battle between the status quo and new ideologies, the former usually triumphs. This is what economic research has been demonstrating. So even though the economy in China is closer to state capitalism than communism, historically the Chinese express legalism, and they're somewhat comfortable with their political structure, as Harvard business writers recently said in a recent publication. The philosophy in China is quite different from that in America. In the West, we assume that the Chinese want democracy. They want respect and rights for the middle class, but they're quite satisfied with their system as long as it delivers.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't predict China becoming a democracy. It's legalism. It will remain a legalistic society for centuries.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you there that I don't see, I mean, for a long time, people were thinking, oh, as countries develop, they'll probably get more democratic, or as you trade more with a non-democratic state is likely to become a democracy, and so that doesn't look like it was going to happen, right? There might be some correlation there, but it's not any kind of eventuality. So I myself, I don't know what the future necessarily holds for China, but yeah, I would agree with you there that I don't see that it's going to become a democracy in any short order. Seems like some the opposite trends in the world seem to be happening now.
Remember, Douglas, China is an ancient civilization, a rich history of institutional complexity and political systems. The Chinese will not change overnight. And I'm often shocked that when serious scholars, people expect to know better, write that China may become democratic, because this suggests an inept and ahistorical understanding of the broader socio-political structure in Chinese history. No one with even a cursory understanding of Chinese legalism and their various political regimes should be predicting that China will become democratic. Look at Japan. After the Meiji Restoration, Japan westernized, but today it's still a collectivistic country. These are Asian civilizations due to cultural and gene cultural co-evolutions. They have a particular framework that is distinct from the West, and they like that framework.
Yeah, so one thing that's always been interesting to me about political economy questions and topics is the extent to which a lot of governments end up copying other kind of governments. And so it seems like, people look at maybe Putin, Erdogan, right? And so it seems like they're kind of become a role model for kind of rightists or more conservative governments. Everyone wants to be the strongman along the lines of Putin or a Trump or something. And so it seems like there's that tendency. The other thing is that I think also, people take simple lessons from different stories. And so one lesson that I think a lot of people maybe took from, so Russia had this early democratization after communism, and it didn't go so well, in the 90s in Russia. And whereas China didn't do the democracy thing, it just moved to kind of Chinese version of capitalism. And in the China case, things went much more smoothly. Whereas Russia, which kind of democratized earlier, it didn't go quite as well. And so people might have inferred from that, oh, well, maybe better not to have the democracy. And so I think that that's just such a small sample size, and there's a lot going on in both countries that make that simple story not necessarily so accurate. But yeah.
Yeah, well, Doug, Russia is an interesting case study because I often remind people that Russia is not a part of the political or philosophical West, and the Russians historically have been skeptical of Western interests. So even though Russia is not a part of Asia proper, philosophically, Russia has a different outlook from people in the West, and they may even be more skeptical of Westerners than Asians.
Yeah. I think so yes and no. There's kind of, so one thing I was surprised at as I moved to Russia is that my image is certainly that the government tends to be very hostile to the West, and I was actually a bit apprehensive on my first trip to Moscow, wondering, what kind of a reception am I going to get as an American in what seems like a somewhat hostile country? And the answer was actually I got a very good treatment. People in Moscow don't tend to listen too much to what the government is saying. That might not be true in the rest of Russia. And actually a lot of kind of cultured or the upper classes of Russia almost kind of look up to the West. They don't necessarily have this anti-Western bias. That said, so some people who are just brainwashed by the news, maybe who are kind of less educated, more kind of like Trump voters in the US, probably they do have kind of more anti-Western sentiment. But surprisingly enough, as a Westerner who lives in Moscow, I rarely feel this kind of sentiment.
Well, Douglas, city air makes you free. There's actually a recent study with that title arguing that people in cities are more tolerant. It has been empirically proven. So maybe you're associating with smarter Russians who don't have a reason to distrust foreigners.
For sure, people who live in the center of Moscow are kind of a select group of Russians, for sure.
Yeah,
So,
but Russia is such an interesting country, Doug. Have you written anything on Russia?
I have not. Part of this is because since I live in Russia, I don't necessarily want to be in a position where I'm critical,
Yes,
putting my
that's not smart.
yeah. So I actually tried to never mention anything about Russian politics on my Twitter, for example.
Yeah.
It would be interesting. I mean, I have I have done a little bit of research in Russia where I was looking at, so basically I did one of these resume studies with a student who was writing her thesis, where we submitted a bunch of resumes from different ethnicities within Russia for job applications. So in Russia, often it seems like there might be a little bit of bias against people who come from the Caucasus regions or from people who are from Central Asia. And so that's essentially what we confirmed by sending out a bunch of resumes with just, the information was the same. We just switched if it's Vladimir from Moscow versus Muhammad from, Cheboksary, who gets more responses on their interview request. And so the answer is actually in Russia, there's actually quite a bit of, it seems at least from the initial results that we got, that there's actually quite a bit of kind of place-based discrimination. So people from Moscow are looked upon more favorably than people who come from the provinces, even if they're both ethnically Russian. And then people from, say, Chechnya and Dagestan tend to do the worst, right? So we did this study as well with another student using Tinder. And looking at how many matches someone gets on Tinder based, using the same pictures, but using a different profile. If it has the same picture, but it's, Muhammad from Chechnya versus an Igor from Moscow. Igor gets more matches than the guy from Chechnya. And it's quite a few more, actually. So that was the one kind of piece of research I've done on Russia. I would also like to do more research on
Social capital in Russia.
Sorry?
Social capital in Russia.
Social capital in Russia. Yes, exactly. So I'd like to do some research on corruption in Russia. So I've heard that actually some universities in Russia are extremely dirty as far as like it. So I was, my dermatologist actually was saying she wanted to get a PhD. She was in like the third year of a PhD program in dermatology, and to finish her PhD, she would have had to pay her advisor. And she didn't want to do it, so she just dropped out. And so I've heard stories like this. I've also heard stories where, so I had a friend who did undergrad in Crimea, and she was saying that paying the professors is just very common and widespread. I've also heard that getting a driver's license in Russia, often you need to pay money. And so I think it would be interesting if, as an economist, to do kind of be kind of like an investigative journalist, and to go in and kind of test and see, catch someone being corrupt in this situation. So I'd be interested, I've always been interested in doing this, but I haven't done it yet. So.
And maybe in your research, you could also shed some light on the origin of corruption in Russia.
Yes. I suspect, I think probably if you go back 150 years, I kind of tend to think that like corruption was probably endemic about everywhere. And then in Western Europe and the US, I think it just kind of got better. It got a bit better over time. In communist countries, I think it just got astronomically worse. And so I would almost guarantee that communism is the big difference. And so one way you can see the effect of communism in Western Europe that I've always thought is you look at basically the border of communism, and you look at what happened on one side of the border versus the other side of the border. So the biggest one in Russia would be the Russian border with Finland. And so Finland is not very corrupt. Russia is very corrupt. What was the difference? Finland was also in the Russian Empire, So you're really controlling for anything before what happened with communism. And, and if you just draw a line down where the former communists, the edge of communism was in Europe, basically everything on the capitalist side is rich or much richer than anything on the communist side was. And of course, it depends how long you were communist for. And the same thing is true, if you go in East Asia. So.
Yeah, communist regimes actually deterred human sociality. In order to engage in economic transactions, one needed the support of a bureaucrat. Bureaucrats were poorly paid, and as such, they often succumb to corruption. Whereas in a truly free market economy, we're able to delve directly into human relations. As I've often said, in a regulated economy, regulations actually create an artificial barrier between human interactions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, for sure. And so the other thing I've noticed traveling in some former or still communist countries like Cuba is that communist people who lived in communist regimes are the most capitalist people that you will ever find. Kind of paradoxically, it's like dramatically displays the failure of socialism. So
Remember, socialism is inefficient. Humans are economic creatures, therefore we need money. And because socialism is so inefficient and the regulations are onerous, socialism nurtures black markets.
yes, it does.
Yes, so socialism actually succeeds in creating more markets instead of destroying them.
Right. I just think in a communist system, basically to survive, you have to be somewhat corrupt. With all the rules as well, you get in a situation like in Russia now, it's still the case. The rules are so complicated that you're always violating some kind of rule.
Yes.
And then when you're in this situation, you're already a little bit corrupt because it's impossible to follow all the rules simultaneously. And whether the rules get enforced end up being, and what does the government like you or not?
A natural playground for rent-seeking activities.
Yeah.
No, obviously free markets are not perfect. They shouldn't be perfect. If markets were perfect, that wouldn't make sense. Remember, markets do well by showing us what can work and what cannot work. So the negative functions of markets are equally effective.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes advocates of free markets only want to promote the virtues of markets. And I say, no, this is wrong. We need to highlight that markets serve a negative function that is positive. Just like innovation, it's a trial and error process. We have to know what fails before we can know what will work. Most innovations won't work.
Right,
So,
right.
yeah, so markets are quite paradoxical, but now we're going to get to the meat of the matter. You wrote a piece on China, and you're smiling, so I'm assuming that you're really excited and ready to go.
I'm very excited. Yes.
Yeah, it is titled Trade-Induced Technological Change. Did Chinese competition really increase European innovation? What's the conclusion? Bloom had a different conclusion from most people.
Yeah, so there was a famous paper that was kind of written when I was a grad student, and it came to the surprising conclusion that the rise of China actually had a positive impact on productivity growth and innovation in Europe. And so this is a very popular thesis, in part because a lot of trade economists are typically, so most trade economists are typically very pro free trade. And so this paper has tended to show that actually with free trade, it's kind of like the holy grail finding that with free trade, you can get faster GDP growth. And, the numbers they got were actually pretty large that, this China shock in Europe actually accounted for kind of a significant fraction of European TFP growth in this period, and of patent growth, for example. I was always a little bit skeptical. I think when I was a grad student, maybe I looked at the paper, I didn't read it carefully. At some point, I was going to be teaching, I was teaching a class on international macro or international trade, trade-ish course. And I decided to teach the paper. And so that was when I really read the paper in detail. And when I did, I noticed all kinds of kind of strange things about the paper. One, the initial table was seemingly missing some fixed effects, which you would expect to see. The methodology of this original Bloom et al. Paper was called a difference in difference. And so basically, they're looking at the difference in sectors which competed with China versus those that didn't compete with China before and after the China shock, right? And so you expect to see that maybe, before the China shock, both the China competing sectors and the non-competing sectors are doing similarly, and then there's a China shock, and maybe there's a huge increase in patent growth after this China shock. So the first thing that we noticed was that typically, when you do a difference in difference, you plot what are called the pre-treatment trends and the post-treatment trends. And so you want to see this diagram that shows what happens to the treatment and control groups before and after the treatment hits. So the first thing we noticed that despite published in one of the top journals and most competitive journals in all of economics, these guys had not plotted any pre-treatment trends. In fact, they had not plotted any data that's relevant in the entire paper. And so this is just a bit of a head scratcher. The very first thing I did was just plot the pre and post-treatment trends. And what they showed was a bit alarming. And so in their data, it turned out that there was no difference pre and post-treatment in the trends and patents. And that even in the China competing sector, the sector that should have been helped, had its innovation boosted, that the level of patents actually went straight to zero in this group of sectors. And so it's kind of the opposite of what these guys concluded. In the non-China competing sectors, patents are also collapsing towards zero. The percentage change was roughly the same in both groups of sectors before or after the China shock. Okay, so what's going on? How did these guys find anything? Well, it just so happened that initially, the number of patents in the China non-competing sectors was higher. They were adding, or sorry, I think it was the China competing sectors had a higher average number of patents beforehand. These guys, they wanted to take logs, but because there's zeros in patents, especially the last year, there was basically no patents, almost no patents. These guys added a 1 plus the number of patents just to make the regressions work, because you can't take the log of 0. So when they did that, it induced a differential bias because the levels of patents were bigger. So if you have a firm that has 1 million patents and you add 1 to it, you're going to induce a small amount of bias, because 1 million and 1 million and 1 is almost the same. But if you have a sector which has just one patent, or a firm that has 1 patent, and you add one patent to 1 patent, the bias is like 50%. So basically, with this problematic functional form, these guys introduced this bias, and they were only picking up this bias in their key regression result. When you look at the paper, though, there was actually, this is only a small part of what was wrong. And so it turned out then that there was actually one set of regressions where they didn't take the log of 1 plus patents. And in that regression, it turned out that they had 3 different coding errors in the regression. And so in this regression, they had found again that Chinese competition led to a big increase in the number of patents. Had they coded their own regression correctly, they would have actually gotten the opposite, that the Chinese competition, they would have found had a strong negative correlation with the number of patents. They would have had the opposite result. And it also would have been highly significant. In that particular regression, there was actually no kind of identification. It was just raw correlation. And actually, I don't necessarily think it proves the case that Chinese competition harmed the number of patents, in part because I think these guys also were very selective about the sample. And there's no causality in that kind of regression. Also, that result does go away if you add in different kinds of fixed effects, and you'd want to add in trends in that situation. And so I don't necessarily, for my paper, can't necessarily say that there is or isn't, or there was or wasn't a positive impact or negative impact of Chinese competition on innovation. I just find that these previous guys' results, which has been highly cited, was not accurate. So.
Okay, well, Robert Atkinson was on the show recently, and
Yep.
he wrote an article in a journal saying that a major study was done, and based on the findings, the rise of China actually deterred competition in the West. He's yet to locate a study arguing that China induced technological innovation, and I guess that the study produced by Bloom is the most famous one.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, so I'm a bit skeptical of that. I think that finding would be a little bit difficult to wait. So, sorry, this study found what?
No, no, I would refer to Robert Atkinson. He did a research and he found that there isn't data showing a relationship between the rise of China and technological innovation in the West.
Yes. Yeah, so I could buy that. There's also this question of what really was the result. So I think there's probably not very airtight research that shows that this had an impact one way or the other. So one thing, yeah, so we were pretty skeptical of the Bloom et al. Data. And so we didn't feel like we had good enough data to really answer this question decisively, what really was the impact. In the US case, the rise of China did wipe out enough industries that probably, if an industry just leaves, you're not going to have any domestic technological growth in that sector. So it could go either way. I think the biggest shock in the US case was the fact that the US lost so many jobs so quickly. So we lost about 3 million manufacturing jobs in the space of a couple of years. And I think that shock kind of led to the US flirtation with the zero lower bound. It was also a big kind of, it was a big demand shock to the economy. And I think it did contribute to the slow growth period that came after. Yeah, so I think it's directly related to the period of slow growth. And so, if an economy is growing slowly for demand reasons, it can also appear like there's slow TFP growth, even though it's all demand based. And so I think this is probably what happened, not necessarily there was really any direct impact on the slowdown in growth. Because another thing that will happen if there's innovation in China, then this can also kind of, eventually the US will also benefit from these innovations. So, new technology will seep out of China and come to the US. US companies will be able to focus on other things to the extent that there's no, big demand shock in the US. And so I think had the US responded with more aggressive stimulus and maybe some exchange rate policy early on, and probably the Bush administration should have done something to kind of prevent such a large share of US manufacturing been offshored, then the US would not have had, as deep of a great recession and slowdown. And so US GDP would be higher. So
well, the causes of the risk of the recession are complicated, but Doug, I'm going to be honest. I'm driven by the data. I'm not particularly emotional about the ascent of China, but I'm also closer to the free market realm of the spectrum.
yeah.
And from a cost benefit analysis standpoint, are the gains derived from trade greater than the disadvantages of the rise of China?
That's a tough one, and I feel like it's very hard to answer, and I can't necessarily answer that. So I think the China shock caused a lot of large negative impacts, and also had a lot of large positive impacts. And so I will say that had the US responded a little bit differently, then I would say that it would have been a net benefit. But the shock of China, I think, was compounded by a number of macroeconomic policy mistakes in the US that made the shock much more damaging. And so I think it's incorrect then to blame China for the fact that maybe the rise of China was kind of handled so poorly in the US. So I guess you could ask, what exactly do I mean by that? And so for the first thing, because the China shock was so large, the US ran into this kind of zero lower bound, the first flirtation with the zero lower bound in 2001, 2002. Now the US could have cut interest rates more. The US cut interest rates more. The dollar would have depreciated more. We would have not as lost so many manufacturing jobs to China. The economy as a whole would have gained, we wouldn't have had such a weak decade of growth. But those low interest rates that we did have kind of contributed to the housing bubble in the US. And so had we had better regulation, maybe we don't have this Great Recession. But I think there's probably no doubt that these low interest rates which were caused in part by the Great Reserve accumulation, where during the 2000s, China accumulated $3 trillion worth of foreign reserves. This is the old joke: $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there. Pretty soon you're talking real money. But China was accumulating dollar reserves on a vast scale. A bunch of other East Asian countries and oil exporters also began to accumulate dollars and other reserve assets on a vast scale. China also had a fixed exchange rate that was pegged at an undervalued rate. Also the Bush administration's fiscal policy was stimulative in this period, which also didn't help, right? Because this also led to dollar appreciation. And then, after the bubble pops in 2008, 2009, now, some people call it a balance sheet recession. And so what you need to do after that is you need to replenish your balance sheet, right? So you need to have savings greater than investment. You need to be running a trade surplus. But because the US tradable sector was essentially destroyed, it was more difficult for the US to do that, right? And so I think the collapse of the US tradable sector was directly related to kind of the slow recovery after 2008 and 2009. And so, a few people back in the day made this point. So Ben Bernanke made this point at some point. I have a few blog posts about it, but macroeconomists have more or less kind of skipped over this and moved on. So
and I think that they should move on, because as an economist, you are interested in the cost benefit analysis framework, I assume that most economists prefer this framework. And Scott Lincecum of the Cato Institute has a piece, and let me just read a snippet. Economists Xavier Jaravel and Eric Sager, for example, found that Chinese import competition between 2000 and 2007, the peak of the China shock, had substantial pro-competitive effects on US firms and generated over $202 billion in consumer benefits via lower prices. That equaled $101,250 in benefits to US consumers per manufacturing job loss, as calculated by the China Shock papers. The following year, Sebastian Stumpner concluded in the American Economic Review that Chinese imports significantly reduced inflation, cutting the price index for consumer goods by 0.19 percentage points per year between 2004 and 2015 as a result of both changes in the prices of existing goods and the entry of new goods, signaling strong pro-competitive effects and improved variety. And he also cites the research of Mary Amity and others. These research also found similarly impressive consumer gains. So from a cost-benefit perspective, the China Shock Doctrine is exaggerated.
Well, so what I would say about that is none of these papers cited mention the most obvious costs, right? So the Chinese shock contribution to the zero lower bound episode and the liquidity trap. So there's this old saying in economics: it takes a lot of Harburger triangles to plug an open gap.
Yes.
And so it's kind of like a joke, because actually it doesn't matter how big these cost savings or decline in inflation are, and also the decline in inflation, by the way, if you're in a liquidity trap, it has a negative impact on the economy, not a positive impact. You're trying to promote inflation in this case. So I'm really not impressed by this line of research. I think it really misses the boat. It's not looking at all about the liquidity trap situation when you're in, when you're not, so put it this way, when you're not in a liquidity trap, say you have a China shock, the central bank can react to this China shock by cutting interest rates. But imagine now that you're in a liquidity trap, which the US is in after 2008. If you're in a liquidity trap, then the central bank can't cut interest rates. You're just going to eat this decline in demand. The economy is just going to eat it. And so you're having a larger Oaken gap. And so these Harburger triangle improvements, which is what these papers measure, just completely misses the point, and it's an order of magnitude type of stuff less than what this Oaken gap stuff would be. So,
all right, and
Yeah.
point taken. So Douglas, how do you? Well, I don't want you to repeat yourself, and maybe you were doing that originally when you discussed the Bush era. But how would you suggest that the U.S. solve this liquidity trap?
So I have on my blog a while back, I made a proposal. Also, so I was reacting there a little bit harshly, but not against you. It was actually a great question, Lipton. You framed that question very well. It was
I'm
very
not emotional. Sorry, I'm not emotional.
Yeah. So no, that was actually a very good question. I was responding actually to more, my vitriol there was aimed more at these researchers rather than the questioner. I wasn't trying to bite the messenger there. Yeah, so how to get out of a liquidity trap. So, there's, as I was always said, there's the foolproof way and then there's others. And so one thing that a lot of macroeconomists haven't focused on as much is one thing you can always do, the foolproof way was always to devalue your exchange rate, right? And so, how did a bunch of countries get out of the Great Depression where they left the gold standard and they devalued, right? So that's always one way. And, I was one of the few economists who advocated that for some European countries like Greece, that they should just leave the euro, devalue their currency. They can print a bunch of money, they can control their own monetary policy. There would have been some negative effects there, of course, too. So that wasn't actually the most preferred method. I also blogged about one potential solution, which I called fiscal QE. And so this is where the central bank prints money and then just sends it to the treasury, right? And so it's a very simple solution. Why would this work? Well, who has ever heard of a politician who couldn't spend a surplus? Right? No one's ever heard of that kind of politician. And so if politicians in Congress suddenly find that they have a fiscal surplus, they're going to spend some of it sooner or later, maybe not this year, maybe next year. On the other hand, politicians who have big deficits each year, it's going to be maybe sound politically popular to let's try to cut the deficit. And so this is what, the Obama administration at one point tried to do this. The Trump administration was left thinking about it less. Of course, the Biden administration has been doing the opposite. So they're not afraid to spend money. So maybe this applies less now. And if they keep spending money like this, then the US should find itself to be out of the liquidity trap pretty soon, which is a good thing. And so this has kind of been missing from the debate over, do we have inflation now? Or is the Biden administration spending too much money? Is that, if the Biden administration spends too much money, the Federal Reserve can raise interest rates to slow down inflation. And it's no harm, no foul. If, on the other hand, the Biden administration doesn't spend enough money and the US stays in a liquidity trap, well, the central bank, they can't push on a string. They can't lower interest rates much below zero. And so the economy stays stuck in a liquidity trap, which is a horrible outcome. And so the risks on the side of doing too much and doing too little are very asymmetric in this case.
All right, Douglas,
Yep.
I'm thinking about Larry Summers and secular stagnation. But during my thought process, I said to myself, when is a low time preference bad? Is delayed gratification always good, or do we need a new economic model to explain current economic trends? I know the question may sound a bit weird because I'm trying to frame it in my head, but I think at this point we need to revisit our approach to economics.
Right, right. No, it's a great question. Yeah. So when you're in a liquidity trap, yeah, part of the goal of the government is to try to get people to spend somehow. And so when you're in this situation, yeah, it's vice is virtue and virtue is vice. A lot of, you're in this kind of Alice in Wonderland world when you're in a liquidity trap where, a trade shock that might be good in normal times is suddenly bad. Being more frugal can actually lead to worse economic outcomes for everyone.
Yes,
So yeah, so
and frugality maybe it's usually sensible but not in every case. So for example,
yeah,
productivity, innovation, and saving, that is my trio to explain economic growth. But interest rates can reflect the level of trust according to economic historians, and interest rates are low. But Douglas, if people are saving for the future, it suggests that they have a moderated sense of confidence. If you save, you're expecting the future to get better, but the future is literally 20 years or 50 years down the line. They don't expect the present to improve anytime soon, and that's the problem.
yeah. I mean, it can be saving can be a sign that people are scared about the future and you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow if you're going to have a job or not, and so you're saving as a result. I mean, so this is aside from the fact that as an economist, I'd also say, from a micro perspective, that most people should probably be saving more money and trying to invest more money, and maybe retiring early, this kind of thing, than what they do. Um, but um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think we're still in a situation where I would be more worried as a macroeconomic policymaker that in 6 months or a year, the US is going to find that we're still more or less in a liquidity trap, would be my
Yes.
biggest fear. And the other fear that, oh, inflation we'll have runaway inflation. I think it's really a small scenario. And the scenario where we still have high inflation in a year, I think is one where probably the economy is booming and or maybe there's some shortage of oil from a terrorist attack or something.
Yeah.
Those are the scenarios.
The point of the story, Douglas, is that present theories cannot shed real light on current economic trends. That's the point of the story.
Wait. So sorry, say that again.
I said the point of the story is that present ideologies cannot shed real light on current economic trends.
Yeah, I mean,
We have a lot of work to do.
so yeah, so that I guess you can say this. Yeah, so I mean, so like pandemic economics are pretty new, right? So I teach a macro class. It's kind of about macro history, and most of the big events in the course are really kind of similar. So we have the Great Depression on the gold standard, and then we have the Great Recession, and there's a lot of similarities between those, and a bunch of other financial crises. The Asian financial crises kind of goes together. The Japan's bout in the liquidity trap since the 90s, also pretty similar. But then you have the pandemic, the Corona session, and that's totally different.
Yeah, and then Douglas, we all are forced to ascertain the link of the pandemic on trust and social capital. Diseases are negatively associated with social capital and long-term innovation if you take the parasitic stress perspective seriously, and I do, because some economists not affiliated to the psychological school of the parasitic stress perspective have also replicated those findings. And I've seen studies indicating that people are critical of those who don't comply with COVID-19 regulations. So the pandemic portends negativities for innovation and long-term trust.
Yeah, I think that could be the case. I hadn't thought about that much myself, but so I do agree, and I did quite a bit of research myself on hysteresis. And I do think, this is a one-time shock, but it's going to have long-felt consequences. And so I do worry about, what happens with human capital growth. I think some people have been living are still self-isolating. So I still have a colleague who, won't eat lunch with the rest of us because there's a pandemic going on. And so I think there's probably some long-term consequences that there exactly along the lines of what you're talking about.
The
I think
parasitic stress.
to innovate as well. I think we innovate when we're around each other. I think it's always good to bump ideas off of each other, and I believe very much in kind of the wisdom of crowds. And you need to be also for research. I think it's important to be around other people and to be talking to other people, and so we're not doing that now.
No.
It's not as much fun. This is a great conversation, but it's not as much fun to talk to people on Zoom as it is in real life.
Yeah, and well, COVID is a reset, and I started the show during the pandemic, and I've been interviewing many brilliant minds like yourself. Luckily for me, I even interviewed Jeffrey Williamson, who's still on fire, but unfortunately, due to health conditions, he's not doing research. But I interviewed Jeffrey Williamson, who is still on fire, still as sharp as hell.
That's great. Yeah, he was one of my advisors' advisor.
Yeah.
Advisors at Harvard. So he's a grandson in a way, yes.
Yeah, I would love for Jeffrey to do more research, but he's in his 80s, and unfortunately, the Jeffrey Williamson publishing company closed down. But for its reign, we are better off, and I said that to him personally. He's a hero of mine. But we're wrapping up, and we're going to talk briefly about income inequality. He did a paper on income inequality, and it is titled "The Rise in Inequality, Technology and Trade, or History and Taxes." You don't have to explain it in depth, just share your main finding, and then we're going to discuss if we should really care about inequality.
Yeah. So one way to summarize this research and kind of my other main paper on manufacturing is that like economists believe for a long time, like kind of the mainstream view was that trade had a big impact on inequality, but that did not cause the decline in manufacturing, right? And so in my research, basically, I found that both of those things were false. That actually trade did cause the decline of U.S. manufacturing, at least the level of manufacturing employment in the U.S. in the 2000s. And then secondly, it didn't actually look like it was the cause of the rise in inequality from like the 1980s until the mid 2000s. And so I did a bunch of kind of experiments and ways to, parse the data and looking at different data sets. And really, I did not find it had a direct impact on inequality. And so kind of, the rise in inequality was kind of a broad-based phenomenon. It was not concentrated in, sectors that compete more with China or sectors that compete more internationally. There was a big trade shock in the middle of the 1980s that then receded. And so the time series wise, it also just doesn't fit the trade shock story. So the big part of the China shock happens in the 2000s. But mostly, the rise of inequality in the U.S. was mostly done by the early 2000s when the China shock really gets started. And so that it's just the evidence on that doesn't fit. So, but it still remains, it's actually a tricky question about inequality in trade. And so I'm not saying that trade has no impact on inequality. So on some level it must, right? So if LeBron James was just playing basketball in Cleveland and there was no globalization, his salary would be much lower than what it is. If there was no trade internationally, Google, Tesla, these would not be as big companies if they were just, focused on trade within California, for example. So on some level, I really do believe that trade, globalization is correlated with kind of this rise in global inequality. I just think it's not necessarily correlated with the rise in inequality that's measured in some data sets from the 1980s to the early 2000s.
Yeah. And
it's a very complicated thing to think about because they're two somewhat sounding contradictory things, but yeah.
Yeah, and income inequality, according to Winship, is not impeding mobility. We should care more about poverty. William Klein recently did a study, and he has shown that some metrics actually underestimate income growth. So the deflator is very important, using the consumer price index versus another index, for example, the personal consumption index. So income inequality is not an issue I'm overly interested in if it's not driven by corruption or rent seeking.
Right,
But
right.
Doug, I enjoyed our conversation, but unfortunately I have to wrap up. So we'll speak again. All right, bye.
All right, thank you very much, Lipton. That was an excellent interview.
All right, then
Thank you. I
bye.
appreciated it. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Bye. Yeah.